Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Prudent Observations. As I can already tell, it is good morning and good afternoon for many of you. I'm very happy to see so many familiar faces in my international audience here with us today. Today we have a rather special book-related stream with you all today. As we've talked about before, very early on in the show, we've covered topics such as, defensive and offensive realism. John J. Mearsheimer's famous book back in the 1990s of The Tragedy of Great Power Politics has been followed up by many books that we've covered on this channel, as well as several influences. One of them, of course, being Barry Posen's book called Restraint, which we'll be talking about a little bit today. But instead, we're going to be talking about his most recent text, his 2018 book, The Great Delusion, International Liberal Dreams and International Realities. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add this to stream, and we're going to also keep me there as well. And we're going to talk about this book, and there's a lot in it, and I feel like it's important, however, for us to get a few things out of the way before we do it. This book was published in 2018, in the middle of the Trump administration. This was before our wonderful certain Chinese delicacy, General Tso's revenge, as well as the increasing amount of securitization and what came afterwards, globally speaking. And this, of course, is before the ongoing events in the conflict in Ukraine. However, Ukraine will get mentioned because, as we know, John J. Mearsheimer has been putting out his thesis on the causes of that conflict since 2014, which is going to be brought up at the end of the stream because Morgoth had recently provided me an interesting little interview with John J. Mearsheimer, courtesy of The New Yorker, which came out just 2 days ago on the 17th. So the point for today's video is to sort of give you an outline and review of the book. We're also going to be doing some reading. If you follow me on Telegram, you can find the PDF link down below. I will find a way to tweet it out so you guys can get access to it as well, and I'll pin it down below in the comments when we're done. But, here we go. We're going to enjoy ourselves a little bit of reading and a little bit of an outline here. So Mearsheimer, of course, has gone on several bit of lecture tours prior to this book, and you'll see it right here, the Henry L. Stimson lecture series. He's given talks about this from, the Bush School of International Governments and Governing Politics. He's given this talk really at any university that he can. He's also on YouTube, which if you follow him there, it's kind of like peak wartime boomer posting because it's like him, Scott Ritter, Colonel McGregor. They're either live or they're reposting their news snippets when they're on the air. It's definitely what I would expect from a bunch of old men posting on Facebook, but nevertheless, the content is very good. So the primary course of this book, which is why I'm going to get into the preface here, because it highlights a lot of the same issues that I think a lot of us that have covered geopolitics, not just on my channel, but either Semigog, Praise of Folly, The Myth of the 20th Century, is that the primary course of the last 30 years has set the United States up for conflicts both at home and abroad. What we traditionally call liberal hegemony, the idea of pursuing a universalizing force of liberal democratic norms across the globe, is meant in the traditional realist lens of security, primacy, survival. However, in pursuing that lens of policy since 1989 onward, Mearsheimer makes the argument that this comes at a substantial cost, not only in blood and treasure, but weakens the position abroad of the United States writ large. To make it very clear, Mearsheimer is not a liberal hegemony kind of guy. He's going to make that very clear. He is an American primacist. He does wish to have the country that he lives in to survive, to function, and thrive. And for a guy that gets as much flack as he does for critiquing liberalism, both in 2016 and 2020, his ballot was for Bernie Sanders. citing that a lot of America's economic issues were the greater domestic, security threat for its foreign policy initiatives writ large. As we've talked about with other book streams, such as the Richard Haas's "The Foreign Policy Begins at Home," a lot of individuals in these circles do realize that you have to balance the foreign with the domestic. And what Mearsheimer is going to talk about today is that the pursuit of liberal hegemony comes not only at substantial cost to your international standing, but it comes at an even higher cost to your domestic politics at home. And a lot of the things that he's warned about and argues in this book, we're going to read a little bit of it. We're going to talk about it today. I think that this is still a really good text, and we're also going to read through it in ways that sort of looks at the last 4 years. So from 2018 to November 19th, 2022, what has changed? Have some of these theses held up? What are the arguments that we're going at? And consider this sort of a preparatory research stream, because I was going to save it for the announcements, but I'll just get it out here. On November 30th, so just around the corner, I will be live with Academic Agent on the Cigar stream, and we'll be covering Nicholas Solda's arguments about Turbo America, or total informational control out of the United States. So this will be somewhat of a preparatory stream to sort of see where some of the arguments go against it and how well they've held up today. So we'll get started here. So Mearsheimer is arguing, and I think it's important for us to read the premise here, because one of the biggest things that comes out of comes out of Mearsheimer, is that one, this policy of liberal hegemony was doomed to fail from the start. And we can read it here. This strategy invariably leads to policies that put a country at odds with nationalism and realism, which ultimately have far more influence on international politics than liberalism does. The basic fact of life that is difficult for most Americans to accept. The United States is a deeply liberal country whose foreign policy elite have an almost knee-jerk hostility both towards nationalism and realism. But this kind of thinking can only lead to trouble on the foreign policy front. American policymakers would be wise to abandon liberal hegemony and pursue a more restrained foreign policy based on realism and a proper understanding of how nationalism constrains great powers. So in this text, you're going to get a trichotomy of sorts. You're going to see his understanding of liberalism, realism, and nationalism. These three texts, or these three ideas, invariably co-mix and commingle, especially in American and by extension Anglospheric foreign policy, and that in this realm here in the United States, the aspect of nationalism, the aspect of realism has faded away, and the trichotomy that has won out has been the singular approach of pursuing liberal hegemony. And in doing so, here at home domestically, this is why you have seen, really since the 1990s, I can remember very early on, I think around 2000, 2001, right before September 11th, there is a episode of Law and Order SVU that, for instance, talks about honor killings and the issue of cultural differences and the Enlightenment liberal tradition that kind of holds to the U.S. about rights, which we're going to get into, because he has an interesting definition of sort of conservative left and, conservative right liberalism, liberal progressive left liberalism that gives a good definition. But and also is what Glenn Greenwald has revealed through things such as WikiLeaks, talking with Edward Snowden, that the United States had changed its political narratives and events towards the war in Afghanistan around 2010, 2011, to focus on women's education, women's rights, and the growing issue of other cultural things here at home, such as the Great Awakening, LGBT rights, etc., which is why you saw a myriad of articles when the United States was withdrawing hastily from Afghanistan, about what will happen to the women, what will happen to the girls' school, what will happen to gay rights. Are we going to resume back with honor killings and stonings and things like that, which so far we have in Afghanistan. It appears to be that case. There was an article that came out, I think, more or less a few short months after what happened to the Afghan school for women, and it just more or less had radically changed and altered in its terms of dress code, appearances, what was taught. And he calls this really the impossible dream. And this is, I put this up in the preface because it's really important for us to sort of realize where he's coming from. I do not think that, like with any man, any human being, John J. Mearsheimer is not infallible. There are going to be parts in this conversation today where we are going to provide some criticism. I will check chat, and I will check entropy as well. So link is pinned in the comments. But This is intended to be a theoretical text, as he argues. This is just his way of looking at it. Um, and so, more or less, this is going to be what we're taking a look at. And the first part that I wanted us to go to is on page 19, because it provides us a pretty decent definition of what kind of liberalism he's talking about. The first chapter is really discussing political liberalism. And so we'll read here. Political liberalism is also built on the assumption that individuals sometimes differ intensely about bedrock political and social issues, which necessitates a state that can maintain order if those disputes threaten to turn violent. Relatedly, liberals place great emphasis on tolerance, a norm that encourages people to go and respect each other despite their fundamental disagreements. But while they disagree on all these matters, liberals are divided by some fundamental differences. Political liberalism, in fact, comes in two varieties, what some call modus vivendi liberalism and progressive liberalism, a terminology that he uses throughout the text. There are basically two important differences between them, first of which concerns how they think about individual rights. Modus vivendi liberalism conceives of rights almost exclusively in terms of individual freedoms, by which they mean the freedom to act without fear of government intrusion. So, sort of the libertarian, conservative, fusionist argument that we see commonly in the American right today. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right to hold property are representative examples of these rights, he says. The government exists to protect these freedoms, but, that's sort of the traditional right-leaning liberal view of it. Progressive liberals will prize the same individual freedoms, which are sometimes called negative rights, but they are also deeply committed to a set of rights that are promoted by the government. They believe, for example, everyone has a right to equal opportunity, which can be achieved only with active government involvement. Modus vivendi liberals are intensely opposed to this notion of positive rights. That does tend to be the traditional liberal dialectic here in both the United States. We've also seen this in the United Kingdom throughout its parliamentary age. And of course, as the foreign policy elite sort of makes its way, and if we want to take sort of the ideological perspective, it is a post hoc rationalization to seize power. We can sort of understand that through reading our de Juvenel, that power tends to centralize. It tends to come up with formulas post hoc in order to keep people in line. This is why sort of the intersectional framework is really effective at maintaining that high-low versus middle balance between positive rights versus those that view things in the negative rights lens here in the United States. However, the issue that I think that Mearsheimer will eventually get into is that the foreign policy elite has a knee-jerk reaction in regards to, not think, I've already read this text, but still for you guys. What Mearsheimer will argue, however, is that the foreign policy elite does knee-jerk itself towards the progressive liberal end, and thus it pursues liberal hegemony. John J. Mearsheimer, Barry Posen, and American historian and international relations professor John G. Eikenberry are very clear that since 1945, although I would argue it goes back, and in fact Mearsheimer argues it goes back much earlier than 1945, that the United States, in its lens of democracy, views all illiberal threats to it as existential. And so liberal hegemony is the opportunity in which that, one, a democratic state can pursue survival. Two, it can pursue national and international primacy so that there are no available alternatives to it. And you can kind of see where I'm going there. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then three, to ensure that democracy stays alive and well, both at home and abroad. Not just in the lens that, it's the only alternative, but it thrives in the essence that people actually want to embrace it, which requires social engineering, which we'll talk a little bit about today. However, Mearsheimer is going to be very quick to call out sort of the issue, and very coincidentally, we've had this recent back and forth on the subject of universalism versus particularism that both Mike from Imperium Press and Academic Agent discussed, as well as Anglo-Ortho's nearly 2-hour response video last night. But on page 85 of this text, it starts talking about nationalism, but I'm going to go off of my notes here and talk about the issues that Mearsheimer points out to be the fundamental issues that exist within the liberal framework. So, particularly, Mearsheimer points out that liberalism does put a lot of emphasis on the individual. It heavily relies on individuation. So regular individuals have protection, for instance, through modus vivendi liberalism, how he argues it, right liberalism, conservative liberalism. that they're mainly focused on the individual. By focusing on the right to property, the right to start a business, the right to be left alone, the individual is the preeminent focus. However, he argues, and I think this is an argument that many have made and made claims to, whether you're a religious conservative or not, that heavy focus on individuation tends to come with the consequences of one, atomized individuals, and two, humans are not fundamentally solitary creatures. We do have a tendency to have interests of our own. We have our own passions. We have our own ambitions. But the problem with trying to universalize that, for instance, when we say we hold these truths to be self evident, as Mearsheimer argues, not every nation is going to see that argument up front. Liberalism, the positive rights, of course, in my viewpoint, views it in some sort of chiliastic secular globalism. I think that we see positive rights being used in a way on a global stage with sort of like the WEF and such, that you can have this sort of you'll own nothing and be happy type deal. And while that phrase constantly gets memed on, this is one of the sort of big projects out of liberal hegemonies that it allows you to coalesce and to transcend into something that's a little more global, and in turn lead to sort of a utopian, chiliastic, millenarian type project. However, the other issue, of course, is that other nations are not culturally socialized to be liberal. This is a rather Western European and especially an American political tradition that is very difficult to socially engineer, and there's a lot of data to back that up, which we'll get to. However, the issue with socialization is that many people are preferable to illiberal liberalism, the idea where nationalist or cultural or ethnic concerns take primacy over the issue of the liberal system, the liberal ideal. This is why you see the European Union label someone like Viktor Orban, for whatever you may think of him. They write down that Hungary is a illiberal autocracy, or that it is an illiberal democratic state, and they have threatened and, of course, bribed the European Union with billions of euros as a sort of an effort to reform democratically and to play by the EU's rules. Mearsheimer also articulates that one of the bigger issues, of course, with enlarging or trying to expand and, by extension, universalize certain projects, such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the World Trade Organization, free trade, etc., is that it comes at substantial cost to yourself, meaning that nations are constrained by their own options because they wish to reap the benefits of the in-group. And you can see this in two ways. If you're a smaller nation state, you're inclined to cede up your sovereignty, to cede up the cultural norms, if it means that you can reap the benefits of, say, collective security, or reaping the benefits of cheaper goods, or having an economic comparative advantage to other nation states that you're engaging with. The other disadvantage that comes with sort of this universalizing project is that nations that are large states, so for instance, the United States, they are constrained by focus. They are no longer able to focus on themselves as effectively. Mearsheimer argues this, for instance, when it comes to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Policies that come and deal with the instance of Ukraine means that the United States is constrained by its articles, its NATO articles, specifically Article 4, and most importantly, Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause. That means it may not be able to pursue a foreign policy that is independent of itself, saying what is in America's interest. Throughout his lectures talking about this book and getting it ready for publication, Mearsheimer had argued that one of the bigger reasons why Donald Trump was elected as president of the United States was on the issue of foreign policy and national interest. Trump had called himself a nationalist. He did. This isn't to gauge the Trump presidency. There are plenty of things that we can criticize it. We talked a lot about criticizing the Trump presidency yesterday on the Old Glory Club stream with Orrin McIntyre. However, Mearsheimer argues that because it was different from the foreign policy elite, it was relatively realist, campaigning on ending foreign wars and not wasting blood and treasure, and trying to reindustrialize the United States. Things that run anathema to liberal hegemony, the aspect of increasing free trade access. Barack Obama famously championed the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a way to entreat and engage China on economics as a mechanism of containment, not just the ongoing militarism that we see out there. This was a big part of his 2011 pivot to Asia, which eventually both Trump had torpedoed, but also had forced Hillary Clinton to do the same. So Liberalism, in its lens of positive rights, tends to constrain. However, this also means that nationalism and liberalism go hand in hand in Western countries. And he talks about this here. So he argues that in popular discourse, nationalism is sometimes said to reflect ancient hatreds, which implies that it has plagued the planet for most of recorded history. This perception is false. Nationalism is a recent phenomenon. It emerged in Europe and, by extension, in North America in the second half of the 18th century, although it was incubating in Europe before then. Liberalism came onto the European scene roughly a century before nationalism. Moreover, although nationalism can lead to hatred among peoples, that is only one facet of a complicated phenomenon that has positive as well as negative attributes. Keep in mind, Mearsheimer is not a reactionary, he's not an extremist. He is a little bit of a Whig historian, but even right here, as he pulls out what is a nation, right? Straight out of the 1848 revolutions in Europe, Ernest Renan famously wrote this text in 1848, What is a Nation? Nations have 6 fundamental features, of course, that distinguish them from large groups. A large community of people. In addition to this, it has an essence of solidarity. They tend to treat others within their own in-group as equals. And alongside this, common language, history, a system of government in which they identify with an ethnic identity that comes along with it. This is why when we talk about sort of the issues, for instance, in universalism versus particularism, I mean, if we take a look at sort of the Greek translations of both the Old Testament, but also in the New, the idea of tribes, nations, and states, it was viewed as ethne. So, I mean, that is very much part of it that comes with it. But he argues that, of course, that liberalism and nationalism go hand in hand, and that you have to balance out the national interest, what is the interest of your nation and your people. However, that comes into a problem with liberals' desire to pursue positive rights, treat the outgroup as something equal. And famously, the issue that Mearsheimer will point out later in this chapter about the necessity for these two ideas to exist, liberalism and nationalism. When I was reading through it, I said the first problem that immediately comes to my mind, of course, is the issue of demographics. It's very easy to mold and change the definition of what nationalism is or what the national interest is if you erode the political will and dispossess those that have been here since the beginning. And we see that very often when we hear individuals like Senator Chuck Schumer wanting to push amnesty on some 13 million illegal immigrants in the United States, saying that the regular people that have been here for the longest time are not pursuing replacement birth rates. But Chuck Schumer has no problem being pro-life when it comes to another country. So, the other thing that he does point out, of course, is that throughout European history, anyone can look back. A lot of people take a look at the sort of confederation of small nation states that made up Germany and Prussia prior to German reunification. More importantly, you can see this throughout the various Italian, European, the Italy, especially with European city-states. And this is what he points out here, whether it's the Hunnic Empire, the Vandal Kingdom seem to spring from nowhere, only to vanish utterly in a few generations. Still, previously obscure peoples such as the Angles and the Franks emerged to create enduring polities. Such fluidity is unthinkable in the age of nationalism, in which nations tend to be tightly integrated, permanent entities separated by clear boundaries. It's hard to imagine any contemporary nation disappearing or even undergoing that sort of rapid transformation in its identity, as Patrick Geary's description of historic life after the Roman Empire. But let me go down a few pages here so we can get to it. So this is where we sort of run into the issue, and it's funny, there's only one reference of Carl Schmitt in here, but it's the very issues that he's written about are all over the place. He says, quote, on page 88, "But it would be impractical for all individuals who make up a nation state to share the same practices and beliefs. There is instead a substantial commonality which varies from case to case. It makes sense to distinguish between thick and thin cultures, which reflect the amount of cultural diversity a nation has. Thick cultures have significant cultural homogeneity, while thin cultures are more diverse. Nation states that are composed of a single nation, such as Japan and Poland, have thick cultures. Those who have a core nation and minority nations, such as Canada, India, Spain, have thin cultures. So does the United States. Most society elites would like to mold a thick national identity, but that is usually not practical in society containing 2 or more nations. Which is why, of course, the issue that liberalism runs into, as Carl Schmitt has famously written about in The Concept of the Political, is that liberalism tries to contain the fundamental differences between individuals. For instance, Mearsheimer in this text will tell you that all forms of politics are always about a fundamental problem and difference of opinion on first principles. The very thing that Schmidt argues that liberalism fails to accomplish. And Mearsheimer, while he doesn't reference him by name, he only references him once as an immigrant, um, but not as someone who, immigrant in the sense that that people that came to the United States, especially a lot of Germans and a lot of German Jews that had came to the U.S. were influenced by writers like Carl Schmitt as much. That's the only time that it's mentioned. However, Mearsheimer points out that those differences of first principles, liberalism doesn't have the tools necessary to accomplish making and ameliorating those problems. This is why we get the fundamental quote about friend versus enemy. This is why liberal hegemony tends to view things as a dualistic binary where you are either liberal or you're not. And because you are illiberal, you are an existential threat to my existence. That sort of becomes the compounding proponent of what Mearsheimer will talk about later in this book about democratic peace theory. So this is where you run into the problem that liberalism tries to sort of ameliorate and prevent sort of conflict from breaking out. This is why we have parliamentary democracy. We have representative government in the federal system here in the United States. However, it tends to run into a problem when it comes to formulating either a cohesive national identity, because you're going to have to eventually consume and destroy the other, which we're kind of seeing happen here in the U.S., and secondly, that also translates really well onto the international stage, which means that democratic societies like the United States and its government, the USG, tends to engage in a lot of conflict abroad, which, again, he talks about the substantial costs that come with that. But he also argues, however, that culture does have limits. For instance, our aspects of culture and how we view ourselves. He cites a lot of the conflict in the Protestant Reformation of Catholics killing Protestants and the vice versa, that it's going to be sometimes difficult to contain that, which is why you saw liberalism really formulate itself afterwards, post-Enlightenment. But of course, it has its issues. All right. So later on, and I'm going to pull it up here because this is actually where he really makes the argument. There we go. Liberalism is the source of trouble. So this is where he really starts to highlight the biggest issue that comes out of it. So the costs of liberal hegemony begin with endless wars. A liberal state ends up fighting in order to protect human rights, spread liberal democracy around the world. Once unleashed on the world stage, a liberal unipole soon becomes addicted to war. Sounds familiar. Militarism arises from 5 factors. First, democratizing the globe is a vast mission that provides abundant opportunities to fight. Second, liberal policymakers believe that they have the right, the responsibility, and the know-how to use military force to achieve their goals. Third, they often approach their task with missionary zeal. Fourth, pursuing liberal hegemony undercuts diplomacy, making it harder to settle disputes with other countries peacefully. Fifth, that ambitious strategy also undermines the notion of sovereignty, a core norm of international politics that is intended to limit interstate conflict. So, of course, the presence of a powerful state prone to fighting a war after war increases the amount of conflict in the international system, creating instability. What do we know that all as, folks? We know that as the security dilemma. We see this all the time when we look at possible places to fight, which only increases the likelihood that other nations are going to spend more on defense and increase themselves in conflict. How much money did the Soviet Union and China pour into Southeast Asia as America continued to pursue its policy of domino theory and went into Vietnam? Untold billions of dollars, both from the Chinese and from the Soviets and their aligned satellite countries. Why? Because it's a lot easier to sort of keep the Americans occupied in Vietnam. That way they're not going elsewhere. And it made it very easy to provide yourself as the political alternative in a bipolar world. That way one can be defended against sort of this impeding, keeping America safe for democracy, making the world safe for democracy, and to not fall into the clutches of communism. The other thing that also is important when we take a look at how liberalism interacts with the rest of the world is that even small and what we would call weaker or smaller states tend to also fight a war and can do it very effectively. For instance, while GDP is not a measure that you want to use, it's important to put things into scope and scale. For instance, throughout the history of the Cold War, at no point in time did the Soviet Union ever have GDP equivalency or matching power to the United States. It was almost always at a 2-to-1 ratio. Our recent examples, of course, in Vietnam, are wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course the ongoing billions of dollars spent in Syria fighting Assad and his regime, terrorist organizations that have most likely been propped up by us, and the current conflict in Ukraine are demonstrative of that. Liberal hegemony also promotes instability in other ways as well. Formidable liberal democracies also tend to embrace ambitious policies short of war that often backfire and poison relations between them and target countries. For example, they often interfere with the politics of other countries. They are also inclined, when engaging diplomatically with an authoritarian country, to disregard its interests and think that they know what's best for it. Finally, liberalism abroad tends to undermine liberalism at home because a militaristic foreign policy invariably forces a powerful national security state prone to violating citizens' civil liberties, which we've seen since 2001, and more recently now across the West, we've seen it since early May of 2020. However, I think a lot of us know that quite a bit of this has been planned, drafted out, or gamed, etc. Mearsheimer's primary argument is that once a country embraces liberal hegemony, it ends up doing more harm than good. So, for instance, American foreign policy since Bill Clinton in 1992, with the end of the Cold War in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States emerged as by far the most powerful country on the planet. This is around the same time that you get Francis Fukuyama's famous article and later book, The End of History and the Last Man. Unsurprisingly, the Clinton administration embraced liberal hegemony from the start, and the policy remained firmly intact through the Bush and Obama administrations. Not surprisingly, the United States has been involved in numerous wars during this period and has failed to achieve meaningful success in almost all of these conflicts. The USG, Washington, has played a central role in destabilizing the greater Middle East to the great detriment of the people living there. Liberal Britain, which has acted as Washington's faithful sidekick in these wars, also bears some share of the blame and the trouble for the United States' helped cause. American policymakers have played a key role in producing major crisis in Russia over Ukraine. At this writing, that crisis shows no signs of abating and is hardly in America's interest, let alone Ukraine's. Back in the United States, American civil liberties have been eroded by an increasingly powerful national security state, and of course in 2022, an increasingly powerful national biosecurity state. But the other issue that, of course, brings itself out here is that the history of sort of liberal hegemony comes in the form of liberal militarism. And we can see this here by this quote that I wrote down that I just want us to read out, because our good friend Radical Liberation, and of course his sideful, wonderful returning guests and co-hosts Turnip and the Black Horse have talked about this, that 126 years of what people like to call the global American empire is an evolution, I think, from its more restrained and isolationist roots. It used to be a progressive notion to be an isolationist. Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, had famously written that God invented wars so that Americans could learn their geography. That's a quote that's always really stuck with me. I quite like it. But he says here, from Elihu Root, who had been both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War under President Theodore Roosevelt, stated, "To be safe, democracy must kill its enemy when it can and where it can. The world cannot be half democratic and half autocratic." In the midst of the Vietnam War, Secretary of State Dean Rusk declared, "The United States cannot be secure until the total international environment is ideologically safe." And as Christopher Lane notes, these are not isolated comments. American statesmen have frequently expressed this view. This missionary zeal, however, is not limited to policymakers. It is a big part of our academic and political tradition and establishment, has been for about 100 some odd years now. John Rawls, for example, writes it is characteristic of liberal and decent peoples that they seek a world in which all people have a well-ordered regime. Their long-range aim is to bring all societies eventually to honor the law of peoples and to become full members in good standing of the society of well-ordered peoples. End quote. This ambitious agenda does not axiomatically lead to war, as Rawls is very careful and clear that he's not advocating for armed crusades. But I think immediately of that poem of All People Under Universal Law, Tennyson poem. Still, there is no question that war is often seen as a viable and even attractive option for promoting liberalism, primarily, of course, by elites. It's oligarchy. That's currently what we're ruled under, is a oligarchy disguised as democracy, because that's usually the best way that you can mask it. This is why, Secretary of Defense, former General Lloyd Austin, was, when he was nominated, still sitting on the board of Raytheon Incorporated. Of course, one of America's largest defense contractors, right up there next to General Electric, Boeing, and Northrop Grumman, and others. And here we are. Of course, the Bush Doctrine developed after September 11th. Our good friend Barry Posen, who had wrote this same book in 2018, The Case for Restraint, A New Foundation for U.S. Grand Strategy, had written that while liberal hegemony had been a policy that had been offered as an option in the 1990s, while Mearsheimer says it's been there since the start, it really takes root in the Bush Doctrine in 2002. And you can see this sort of language of universalizing come out, where either Bush is using the term crusade or reinforcing, as Paul Gottfried writes in Anti-Fascism, A Century of Crusade, about, or a Global Crusade, excuse me, where the idea of stomping out illiberal facets of the world usually comes in the form of anti-fascism. Especially, we saw this during the Cold War, especially with America's interventions in the Middle East, South America, and Africa, but also more recently with phrases like Bush, courtesy from people like David Frum, who are still on Twitter that you can harass until you eventually get blocked, like myself. That's not a targeted harassment claim, YouTube. I'm just saying that that's what can happen. About the axis of evil with regards to nations like Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. But the problem with liberal hegemony is that oftentimes it will often throw out negotiation and diplomacy out the window. War and diplomacy are often distinct instruments of statecraft, he writes. Each is an alternative to the other. One relies on dialogue and negotiations to settle disputes, while the other employs military force. Of course, war is a continuation of political intercourse by other means. But liberal democracies, he writes, have little difficulty conducting diplomacy with illiberal states when they are acting according to realist dictates, which is most of the time. In those circumstances, liberal democracies will do whatever is necessary to maximize their survival prospects, and that includes negotiations with authoritarian leaders. They sometimes even support or form alliances with murderous dictators, as the United States did in World War II when it worked with Joseph Stalin to defeat Nazi Germany, or when it cooperated with Mao Zedong after 1972 to contain the Soviet Union, taking advantage of the Sino-Soviet split. Occasionally, they overthrow democratic regimes they perceive as hostile. Liberal democracies go to great lengths to disguise their behavior with liberal rhetoric, but in fact they are acting contrary to their own principles, such as the influence of realpolitik. And if you recall a few months ago when we covered the monk debate between Stephen M. Walt, John J. Mearsheimer, Radek Sikorski, which is married to Anne Applebaum. So there's, like I said on that stream, there was no real Russian or Ukrainian representation at all. So the argument over agency was moot. However, the issue there is that, politicians lie. And, of course, Michael McFaul just screams, yes, let's be real, guys. And of course, it's a way, of course, that can undermine here where diplomacy can get shortchanged because they're going against their own principles. It makes us look like hypocrites, and it becomes very easy for illiberal actors to point to liberal states like the United States and call them out for human rights abuses. This is why, in a lot of ways, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union and China would call out the United States for its track record, holding it up to its own standards, to take a little bit out of Rules for Radicals, when it came to the issue of civil rights, integration, busing, and so on, to sort of criticize the pristine democratic image of the United States abroad. And the same is happening now, where even China, People's Republic of China, puts out human rights abuses reports on the United States and how we conduct ourselves at home, with many that sounds like progressive platitudes, and they are, because that's the standard in which China is hoisting the U.S. on its own rhetorical and political petard. Diplomacy gets shortchanged, however, Mearsheimer writes, when a unipolar state is able to push aside balance of power logic and adopt a liberal foreign policy. Such a state is strongly inclined to eschew diplomacy with its illiberal foes for reasons that by now should be familiar. Although tolerance is a core principle of liberalism, it tends to get pushed aside when a liberal state confronts a rival that violates its citizens' rights. After all, rights are inalienable. Since authoritarian states regularly shortchange and sometimes trample on the rights of people, liberal states freed from the shackles of realism are likely to treat them as deeply flawed policies not worthy of diplomatic engagement. But it's not just that. Of course, the key phrase in this passage that we were just reading is a unipolar state. This is the big issue about the balance of power. This is sort of the big debate about the terms of multipolarity. When we've talked about international institutions before that have a lot of governing and a lot of sovereignty over nation states, particularly when we covered the political concept of neo-functionalism last year, when we talked about the issue of how the European Union operates. This is why you can see that we can hold votes on certain issues over and over and over again until they get the desired result that they want, not to diplomacy, but to beat them over the head with the ballot box. And now, again, we're seeing the same sort of thing happen with nations like Poland and Hungary, and some of them are trying to begin to engage on their own in ways that are sort of meant to act as political and economic blocks against the EU. Whether or not they succeed, only time will tell. But this is the way in which illiberal states, or states that don't conform to what we might call the pause or liberal hegemony, of course, Mearsheimer's a little nicer with his rhetoric than I am, about how to sort of resist it, where nationalism still has influence, where the ethnic and cultural ties are thicker cultures than, say, a very thinly veiled monoculture. And we talked about this also, and this is why I find Kierkegaard's idea of the leveling to hold a lot of weight still today in 2022, because in a thin culture, in a heterogeneous culture, it's very hard to create a national identity that binds people together, which is why you have to subsume and envelop the other culture, primarily along the lens of what we've seen here in the United States in the riots of 2020. Or even more recently, where the UK had their Oxford Hall debates over the issue of reparations, and you had some fat, he was quite fat, this fat Indian fellow talking about the need for them. Although he's speaking their language, he's in Oxford Hall. I think reparations have been paid, not to mention he's overweight, so it's definitely been paid. But it does illustrate, again, some of the problems that exist. Oh, and here's the fun bit, since we're talking about Michael McFaul and Ukraine. Where are you, Michael? Hold on. He's in here. But I'll pull it up in just a second because I have the page number here somewhere. Oh, here we go. Perfect. So yeah, here we go. Page 159 is the one I wanted. So, for instance, when we want to talk about the costs of liberal hegemony and some of the insanity that comes with it. This comes when it happens with social engineering. So this is something that we were talking about earlier, about implementing and trying to universalize. This is where Rand Paul had famously called out that you can't expect an Iraqi to turn into Thomas Jefferson. They're just not. Here we go. So he argues here, the historical record that the effort to impose democracy on another country usually fails. Andrew Interline and J. Michael Grieg, for example, examined 43 cases of imposed democratic regimes between the years 1800 and 1994, and found that 63%, almost two-thirds, failed. Jeffrey Pickering and Mark Pisani, who are investigating democratizing consequences of interventions of liberal states from 1946 to 1996, so a little more recent, concluded that, quote, liberal intervention has only rarely played a role in the democratization since 1945. And so there's just a laundry list here of statistics and articles and studies that demonstrate that, hey, the costs that come with that tend not to work. But if we go a little bit further down, we can now sort of talk about Michael McFaul and others on the issue of Ukraine. So traditionally, and this I don't think is the most coherent argument, And I think that it sort of underpins some of the arguments made about Russia's own political agency and its own geopolitical goals. But for instance, here's where, again, we're getting a lot of the same arguments that John J. Mearsheimer has made since 2014, that the conflict in Ukraine is primarily the West's fault. Oh, and look at that. We got a book that still spells Kiev the way it did before the war. I feel like it's a rare treat these days. They've also changed the spelling for chicken Kiev. I saw that the other day in Walmart looking to buy some large bags of frozen vegetables. And I had saw that even here in the U.S., chicken Kiev had been changed to its now wartime spelling, its Ukrainian spelling. So this is where he talks about the issue in regards to Russian expansion and the changing aspect of what might come from here. Boris Yeltsin said, for example, NATO's 1995 bombing against Serbia, quote, "This is the first sign of what could happen when NATO comes right up to the Russian Federation's borders. The flame of war could burst out across the whole of Europe," which if the recent little debacle over in Poland had been any example, it's very easy, apparently, to almost meme ourselves into World War III. But, of course, we're going to talk about 2004 and 2008 with Georgia, and now more recently in 2014 in Ukraine. But he has a point in here, for example. The new government in Kiev was thoroughly pro-Western and anti-Russian. Moreover, it contained 4 members of who could legitimately be labeled as neo-fascists. Most importantly, the U.S. government backed a coup, although to the full extent of its involvement is unknown. Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and Senator John McCain, Republican from Arizona, for example, participated in anti-government demonstrations, while the U.S. ambassador in Kiev proclaimed after the coup that it was a day for the history books. A leaked transcript of the phone conversation revealed that Nuland advocated regime change and wanted Arseny Yatsenyuk, who was a pro-Western, to become prime minister in the new government, which he did. It is hardly surprising that the Russians, of all persuasions, think that Western provocateurs, especially the CIA, helped overthrow Yanukovych. Whether or not that's the fully accurate story, and I do not think that we're going to ever get that story in our lifetimes, to me it is illustrative of the fact that perceptions matter. This is why Mearsheimer articulates that some of the biggest cost that comes to it is international standing, increases the likelihood for war, and leads to failed democratization. Prior to the current conflict in the year of our Lord 2022, you can find articles from The Guardian from 2020, 2019, 2018, 2017, that whether it was, of course, the current individual, Zelensky, or Petro Poroshenko, Ukraine was known for its increasingly high levels of corruption and being one of the most corrupt, quote-unquote, democratic states in all of the European continent. But the other issue that I wanted to talk about today's book, before we get to sort of an outline, and then we'll get to the Atlantic article, is the subject of norms. So the argument about norms in liberal democratic states, as we always like to talk about a rules-based order, they've got a lot of problems, and he's going to outline them for us that I think it's important for us to read. And if you want this book for yourself, like I said, I will find a way to upload it, and so you all have access to it, and you can have a great 293-page book for you all to read. I noticed that user M in the chat at the very beginning of today's stream had said he was reading The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. It's a great read. I think this is a pretty good one, too. And at some point in time, Radical Liberation and I are going to cover the spiciest book of all of them, of course, which is The Israel Lobby and on U.S. foreign policy. That was written in 2008 with Stephen M. Walt, sort of his realist partner in crime. All right. There are 5 problems with the claim that liberal democratic norms are a powerful force for peace. As he argues in Chapter 5, without a high authority to maintain order, liberalism cannot work as advertised. Now, what is one of the basic presumptions of liberalism? Not liberal, of realism. What is the basic assumption? The world is anarchic. There is no actively participating global sovereign on this earth. There is no king that rules over all the nations of the earth, physically speaking. There is no great arbitrator. I mean, our closest equivalent is the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council, and there are plenty of literature that will tell you that how ineffectual that can be. Of course, the lack of any sort of consensus when it comes to the United Nations Security Council. Each nation state has, of course, only veto power. It's not expanded to include larger or nuclear armed states. Of course, all 5 powers that are on the permanent UN Security Council, France, the UK, the United States, Russia, and China, are nuclear armed. I do think that if you wanted to expand or to reform the United Nations Security Council, it should include all nuclear armed states. So that would require nation states like India, Pakistan, Israel, North Korea to have them as well. I think that would probably be actually more interesting for international politics, because I think that once you legitimize nuclear powers, that changes the way in which diplomacy can happen. I mean, that's why nation states pursue nuclear weapons. We talked about this at the beginning of this month. They pursue it not only for legitimation, but also to keep people off their back. Why do we know that Muammar Gaddafi wanted to pursue nuclear weapons programs? To defend his territory, but also to sort of engage in sort of a Muslim united sort of North African area. He was the founder of the African Union, and there is a lot of now declassified communication between Muammar Gaddafi and when Kazakhstan was recently created as an independent state, that he wanted to pursue buying fissile material and the technology and staff. That way, Libya could pursue its own nuclear weapons policy. And by extension, that probably would mean Iran, which would really not be in the West's interest, or at least the United States' interest as a liberal power. But I think that if this is my idea, this is an aside tangent, and I'll get back on topic in a second. I just do think that the UNSC could be a lot more interesting and probably a lot more effective at recognizing the global, scale of these weapons if nuclear armed states were on there. But I may have to think that out more thoroughly and come back to that and denounce that idea. But I, for one, sort of recognize that that's your ultimate, trump card. That's your ace in the hole all the time as a nation state, is the access of proliferation of nuclear weapons for both first strike and second strike capability. But since there is no world state, there is no higher authority, he writes, in the international system to which countries can turn to when another state threatens them. That is a simple fact of life, coupled with the fact that liberal democracies are not always tolerant, respectful, and peaceful towards each other, means they must worry about their survival even when dealing with other liberal democracies. As Henry Kissinger had once said, to be an enemy of the United States is painful, but to be an ally of the United States is fatal. Once this logic is at play, they have no other choice but to engage in balance of power politics as another. But the one last section that I wanted to hit on, and then I'm going to do a little sort of concluding wrap up, and we'll talk about the New Yorker article, is some stuff that I think is going to be rather relevant for our discussion on Turbo America. And this is sort of the argument about where the United States is headed. Now, remember, this happened in 2018. This was before our wonderful, Kung Pao Sicken. This was long before the lockdowns, the Great Reset being pushed forward by Klaus Schwab and others, or at least far more publicly and accelerated. So he argues, where's the United States headed? And I'm going to leave it at here, and then we'll get to the rest. The American foreign policy establishment would surely resist any move to abandon the pursuit of liberal hegemony and adopt a foreign policy based on realism. Both Democratic and Republican parties are deeply wedded to promoting liberalism abroad, even though that policy has been a failure almost at every turn. Although the American public tends to favor restraint, the governing elites pay little attention to public opinion until they have to when formulating foreign policy. Nevertheless, it is good reason to think that the situation is about to change, for reasons beyond the control of the foreign policy establishment. It appears that the structures of the international system is moving towards multipolarity. Because of China's striking rise and the resurrection of Russian power, the two very things that Richard Hanania, Nicolas Saldo, and Francis Fukuyama have criticized, again, pre-COVID. This development is likely to bring realism back to the fore in Washington, since it is impossible to pursue liberal hegemony when there are other great powers in the international system. American policymakers have not had to concern themselves with the global balance of power since the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, but the unipolar system that has been very short-lived, which means the United States will once again have to worry about other great powers. Indeed, Trump's administration has made it clear, to quote Secretary of Defense James Mattis, that great power competition between nations is reality once again, and still is, even to this day. And great power competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of U.S. national security strategy. In a world where of three great powers, one of which of them has China's potential military might, there is sure to be security competition and even war. The United States will have little choice but to adopt a realist foreign policy, simply because it must prevent China from becoming a regional hegemon in Asia. That task will still not be easy if China continues to grow economically and militarily. Well, that China has not boned well with its zero COVID policy, which has been one of the biggest reasons why they've argued that its rise has been somewhat curtailed. Still, liberalism is likely to continue to influence U.S. foreign policy abroad in small ways, as the impulse to spread democracy is by now hardwired into the foreign policy establishment's DNA. Although great power competition will prevent Washington from fully embracing liberal hegemony, the temptation to pursue liberal policies abroad will be ever present. In addition to the lingering tendency to adopt liberal strategies on the margins of a largely realist foreign policy, there is also the danger that U.S. foreign policymakers will not fully grasp that nationalism limits their ability to intervene in other countries, just as much as it limits their adversaries' ability to conquer other states. They failed to understand the effects of nationalism during the Cold War and even in the post-Cold War world, and there is no assurance that it will get there in the future. Even with the return of realism and the demise of liberal hegemony, it will still be the It will still be the imperative to sound the toxins and about the dangers of liberal foreign policy and the importance of understanding how nationalism limits great powers' ability to act. However, and this is where he sort of hedges his bet, there is also the alternative scenario. The Chinese economy could encounter serious problems that markedly slow its growth over the long term, while the American economy grows at a slow pace. In that situation, the present power gap, which clearly favors the United States, would widen even further to make it impossible for China to challenge American power. One might wonder whether Russia is likely to pose a future challenge to the United States, even if China does not. America's three principal great power rivals in the 20th century, Germany, Japan, and Russia, are all depopulating, and the United States is likely to become increasingly powerful relative to each of them over the next few decades. Although what America will look like, I have no idea. China is the only country on the planet that has the potential to challenge the U.S. power in any meaningful way. I would disagree. I think that we should always take into consideration. This is why you can't use GDP as an effective measure. Because there was all these arguments about the rise of China, U.S. or China surpassing the United States in GDP, surpassing it in purchasing power parity. And again, there's still a lot of issues inside of China that we have to deal with, whether it's rampant corruption, of course, it's ethnic issues. That's why we've seen, both Tibet, the Han dealing with the Uyghurs and so on. And then, of course, now in 2022 with the issue over the economy. Although the United States is most likely, of course, heading towards recession in that way as well. And so this may be where we're at, is because the likelihood of great power competition being stifled both by, one, looting the treasury here in the United States to sort of keep Russia involved in a Syria-like proxy conflict inside of Ukraine, on top of the fact that China's pursued a zero COVID policy that has crippled its economy and has limited its own foreign policy ambitions in a lot of ways, means that perhaps what Niccolo Saldo argues, which you should read his work, we'll cover it on the 30th, might have a very viable avenue, being that is really where we're going. But only time will tell. I do think that it may be premature to call that based upon how the economy is going and how perilously we get close to engaging in economic conflict and global conflict because of individuals that want it to escalate, such as Zelensky and so on. But with that, just to give you my final sort of wrap up here and review of the text itself, ladies and gents. Oops, hold on. Yeah, it is a rubbish way, 99 Iron Duke, to measure real wealth, but unfortunately, it's the way that a lot of people tend to do. So, here we go. Well, the USA thinking that China's a big sweatshop is outdated. I agree, which is why we're going to talk about it next on the 30th, that Wednesday, because I do think there's actually a lot to critique there, and I've been doing my research on it as well, because we really do only get to see what China wants to see, as Lowell points out. But this 2018 text outlines three things. It outlines a trichotomy of sorts in foreign policy establishments here in the United States, and by extension the West, breaking it down in the lens of nationalism, realism, and liberalism. The problem therein that exists is that nationalism can have an impact on limiting what liberal hegemony pursuers, so liberal foreign policy initiatives, can do, and can often lead to backfiring. Two, it outlines the issue, of course, that comes with trying to universalize democracy In doing so, it becomes one, rather ineffective through social engineering, as the data indicates, and two, when doing so, it is likely to encounter competition from those that resist at home, um, both at home and abroad, which is why you see smaller states having the ability to resist, and even people here at home resisting against it. And then, of course, the issue of realism, which identifies the fact that balance of power politics is necessary. It often runs toe to toe with the liberal ambitions of nation states. And then, secondly, the other thing that he points out is that realism often runs in the fly of what nations wish to pursue, which is primacy over survival and unipolarity over others, which means that liberalism, through the lens of realism, liberal hegemony through the lens of realism has a likelihood and propensity to engage in conflict, which can only set the United States up for further depriving its citizens of any rights and can in turn reorganize the nation itself into ways in which are unrecognizable. And this is coming from a guy, again, who wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders twice. He's not really what I would call to be your arch reactionary, but there is certainly a lot of bit about there that is worth taking a look at. But the one other thing that I wanted for us to cover today, real quick here for you all, is this article that Morgoth had brought to my attention, a little Q&A on the war in Ukraine from Mearsheimer's views, and I hope we have some, as soon as we talk about a hot war, the sex bots come in. So thank you, ladies and gents. If my wonderful admins are in here, then thank you. I appreciate that. But okay, here we go. So this is from the New Yorker. All right, so John Mearsheimer's on Putin's ambitions after 9 months of the war. The realist political scientist explains why Russia's move to annex 4 Ukrainian provinces isn't imperialism. Again, I don't think that Mearsheimer is infallible. I think that a lot of nation states wish to pursue hegemony, and that can come in the lens of, we don't call it imperialism, but it is what it is. It is imperialism. So this came out just a few days ago. So we're going to get to the questions real quick. They spoke by the phone. Apparently, he was recently having a conversation with Viktor Orban in Hungary, which tends to be the case for a lot of realists, scholars, but also a lot of conservatives as well. I don't like Rod Dreher has recently moved there, although I think that may be for legal reasons. So since the last time they talked, which was in February, what in your view has changed since, or stayed the same about the way you see the war in Ukraine? He argues that it's become increasingly clear that the Russians are having difficulties defeating the Ukrainians in ways most people didn't anticipate back when we first talked. What has also changed is the way the war has escalated. The Russians are behaving more ruthlessly towards the Ukrainians than they were initially, and that the Russians are now tearing apart the electric grid, which is causing immense human suffering and doing grave economic damage to Ukraine, is evidence of this. He says, well, why do you think that the Russians are being so brutal? And very straightforward. I just think that Russia wants to win this war, and to win the war, you have to invariably look for ways to escalate and to gain advantage over the other side. But the other part here that I thought was really interesting, I'm going to scroll down a little bit. So here we go. There was an argument about what Putin's aims were, whether they were primarily imperial, about taking more land and integrating it into Russia, or they were about NATO expansion. And then when the war starts, at the least in areas where he's conquered, it seems to be pursuing the former goal. It feels a little unprovable to say, well, he's only doing that now, not because people saying so initially were right. So here's his argument. Well, first of all, there's no evidence that he had imperial ambitions before the war. He would have had to say that it was desirable. But again, this would require people to lie, which he's written. He has a great lecture about why the heads of state do lie. I think that he's running a little contradictory here. There would have to be evidence that he had said that it was desirable to conquer Ukraine and incorporate into Russia, which tends to be the claim. That he would have to have evidence that he said it was feasible, and that there would have to be evidence to say that that's what he was doing. And there was no evidence to support any of those. Even your traditional sort of more offensive realist guys, or even sort of neoconservative types like Luttwak, of course, had argued that the amount of forces that Russia had put into the war initially were not enough to conquer the entirety of the Ukrainian territory. And I love this, though. It says that this guy constantly brings up the 2016 Russian interference election, and, he... and more or less he's just talking about, well, we don't have enough evidence for that. And the New Yorker interview goes, oh, really? I didn't know that was still such a hotly debated topic, almost as if that was just the traditional liberal orthodoxy. So, for instance, he had said that the Ukrainians and Russians are one people. He said that before the war. He said that in a famous article that he wrote well, it's from the Kremlin itself. I wonder, pull that up in a minute. That he wrote in July 12th of 2021. But that same article, he made it very clear that he recognized Ukrainian nationalism. He recognized that Ukraine was a sovereign state, and that there was no evidence that he was bent on conquering Ukraine as a whole and getting it into Russia. I do think, and it's something that Semyagog and I have talked about, that he would have, I mean, militarily speaking, I think one of the goals would be probably to take the territory of Ukraine that actually has access to the Black Sea. So to connect from Transnistria all the way over towards the Crimean Peninsula itself, to really turn Ukraine into a rump state that could be limited economically because it has no access to the Black Sea. If it wanted to, it would have to deal with the Russians. And so even if it wanted to join the European Union, right, its economic productivity would be severed. But I'm going to link this in the chat for you all to read on your own here as well. But yeah, well, the New Yorker, I know. But it's something to read for yourself. I always recommend that, of course, you do it in regards to, archive it. But I think Jayens, you have a very good point here that I don't think they understand what actual war brutality looked like in 2022. And I mean, bombing the electric grid, going after oil and gas fields, trying to eliminate things that typically come in a shock and awe lens, I think are important things to take a look at when it comes to these kind of conflicts. I mean, this is, for all intents and purposes, what a traditional great power conflict looks like, where tens of thousands of people are dead, and that the killing is rather indiscriminate and can happen at any time. And I think that that's really the important issue for us to consider here. Regardless of whether you take a conservative or liberal estimate of casualties on both for the Ukrainians and the Russians, this is what state versus state warfare looks like. Even though the Ukrainian armed forces have support from Western armaments, advisors, and intelligence, to me it is indicative of the fact that we haven't seen a conflict like this happen for a very, very long term or a long time. And now we're going to see it firsthand. Because the last 25 years have been explicated by limited engagements or through multinational orders, whether it's dealing with Serbia and Kosovo and Bosnia, and of course the issues in Iraq and Afghanistan. And while those casualties were also high by American standards of thousands of men lost, not to mention the impact it still has today with suicides, Americans aren't used to the idea of, say, for instance, 10,000 soldiers, right, getting killed in maybe a 2-month period. It's just, we've never had to experience that since the Second World War. And that's something that a lot of the realists have been making claim about, not just Mearsheimer, but Dr. Sumatra Mitra and others, is that the American public does not have the psyche to recognize that. And so, yeah, I mean, that's definitely where we're at. Steve says, Mearsheimer said on a podcast that there was a good case to be made for isolationism, but the deep state, he used that term, has made its decision. Well, yeah, I mean, that's definitely the case for sure. I mean, that's going to be the case. I think that it kind of has become clear, whether it's, the whole Biden family deal or the situation that comes with regards to our Nancy Pelosi, right, in her trading bit, that the deep state has made its decision because liberal hegemony is good for business. War is a racket when you can use democracy as the cudgel to bash your enemies against the rock. But I don't know if contemporary America could contain that loss. I mean, that was the question that Dr. Mitra had made at the recent NatCon conference this year, where he was like, I don't think Americans could picture, for instance, when September 11th happened in 2001, almost 3,000 Americans had died, right? Relatively instantaneously. Consider the crew of a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier getting hit by a long-range missile from, say, the Chinese coast. You're probably tripling that number, around 10,000 people. And I don't think anyone could comprehend what that would look like. And so, no, I don't think so. And I don't even think the establishment does, which is why General Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, and even the Biden administration has now kind of come out since this whole Polish missile thing about, hey, or the whole missiles landing in Poland bit, that you need to calm the hell down. Because clearly, no, these people have no idea what they're looking at or what they're into. But The text I will make available for you all to read. I have it already out there on my Telegram for you all to read as well. So with that, I hope that you've enjoyed some of the reading, some of the notes. It's a fantastic book. I do think that some parts of it have not held up as well in today's age, especially since COVID, and especially since we're heading towards a global recession. But I do think that it highlights the key issue that liberal hegemony is costly, detrimental to not only the domestic situation at home, but also towards other nations abroad. You cannot instill democracy in other places. That the Enlightenment form of universalism is something that you are going to see a lot of people take issue with, um, and even someone like myself, an Orthodox Christian, take issue with. Um, because it's not it is not abiding to any universal truth that we would proclaim comes from the gospel and from the word of God. This instead is, of course, using imperfect tools by imperfect sinful beings to impose their will upon others, and tends to do so in ways that ignores the particular ways in which that can be reflected. In the same way that, for instance, American nationalism and its particularist lens of viewing things is vastly different than, say, Hindu nationalism. And I know people that are ardent Hindu traditionalists and wish to see that religion prosper and survive within its own country, and reflects it within their own democratic process. Democracy has different ways of expressing itself, just as Christianity has different ways of expressing itself. It all expresses itself towards universal truth. And I mean, for instance, that's why I think in a lot of ways that Orthodoxy does an example of how it shows particularist forms of expressing a universal truth with its various churches and its apostolic sees. But I may have to do an essay or a video on that subject as well, and I would have to rewatch the cigar stream in whole. I watched Anglo-Ortho's responses. I have some issues with it. But also, I think I would have to rewatch AA and Mike's conversation, because it did seem very much oriented around the Enlightenment liberal tradition, which is sort of what Mearsheimer talks about here. But that is a project for the future, but I have a lot more that I'm going to go. But first, let's do announcements and then Frog of the Week and Super Chats. So we're going to stop sharing real quick. And then we're going to head on over and pull up our wonderful stream on announcements, because there's actually a lot I have in store for you guys. But first of all, slideshow, please, so no one can see the frog yet. All right, so of course, as I've already announced already, I will be on the cigar stream on November 30th. We're going to cover Nicolas Saldo's issue of Turbo America and things like that. So there's going to be definitely quite a bit coming. I'm very excited for it. This is the first time I've done a cigar stream with AA that's solo. The last time I did one with him was the Carlisle Great Man stream, where all of us got to act as unknown Americans and such. Next week is going to be our stream on deglobalization with Semiagog, which I think is also going to be pertinent information for us to know as we prepare for the 30th as well. I'm going to be doing, for patrons, this is a fun bit, I'll be doing readings and commentary on the book, Murray Friedman's book, What Went Wrong? The Creation and the Collapse of the Black Jewish Alliance. And we're going to be talking about that book in a little bit with Dimes from the Blood Satellite podcast. So he's getting a copy to read. I'll be doing readings with my patrons, so more good stuff for you guys over on Subscribestar, as well as Substack. So you guys are going to have access to a lot of fun stuff there. And of course, the Old Glory Club is our American venture that we're working on. A lot of what we aim to do, not only just to talk about sort of things going on here in the United States, but to take that above and beyond towards eventually creating things that are going to allow us to help our fellow countrymen when they need it. Sort of the tradition of mutual aid societies here in the U.S. We're going to definitely bring that back up. So, and of course, this week's episode of the Digital Archipelago will be on my channel, which means any future videos that I have will be out that next week. And then tonight, I will be reviewing the article by Stephen M. Walt from Foreign Affairs magazine, How to Build a Better World Order, Limiting Great Power Rivalry in an Anarchic World. Him and Danny Roderick had written this last month for the September-October issue. So that'll be a lot of great stuff coming for you guys. All the more reason to subscribe over on subscribestar.com. You guys make things all that easier in this difficult time in our lives, especially with the current economic situation. But now on to Frog of the Week and answering everyone's super chats. So let's get started. All right, so this week's Frog of the Week is the Caucasian parsley frog, found throughout Russia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and in some parts of Armenia. And so it is a not actually commonly studied frog at all in this regard, actually. And in fact, there's more studies that need to be done by it because its habitat is being threatened. As an insectivore, however, though, it tends to find refuge in the cave systems where it lives in its habitat. And we know this because what little knowledge we have, the bugs that it tends to eat are usually, covered in guano, so which is bat droppings. So they tend to hang out in caves when they can. They are mostly found to breed, however, in vernal ponds and wetlands, mating in the very early spring, usually around March, April time, because they normally will head into the caves during the summertime when it gets too hot. You can find them, however, in wetlands and other temperate forests and climates, but not the tundra. And in fact, if you were to look up a map of where these guys are, they are in heavily forested areas in these respective countries. However, their habitats are threatened by deforestation, and even the Russian Institute for Natural Sciences has claimed that there is more that needs to be done in studying and understanding on how to care and preserve these frogs. And yes, you will eat guano-covered bugs, JNs. You will. That's what all good frogs do. But that's this week's Frog of the Week, the Caucasian parsley frog. I have to always give a shout out to my friend and patron Lance Goebel, who puts out the argument, or who puts out a list. He has a sort of a Word document spreadsheet, so I don't ever repeat Frog of the Week. But yeah. Oh, and apparently afterwards, 99 Iron Duke will be live in his channel in about 45 minutes. So be sure to head on over to him. He's a good Australian guy. I quite enjoy his work. But that's where we're at. Okay, so now I want to, of course, catch up with super chats and such, as well as shill a few things. But as always, thank you to my top tier patrons who donate $20 or more a month on Subscribestar, which includes Fearless Leader, Raging Mandrill User 4A5B 5DB5, Cowering Bugman, Winston Fujimori, Preservatism Focron, Consumer Hunger, and Voluble Ox. You guys make it all possible to do the things that I do here and to be a little more prolific with my work. There are plenty of ways for you to enjoy the work and content, whether it's on Substack, Subscribestar, channel memberships, wonderful coffee mugs, such as, I'm just here for Frog of the Week. That's actually been very popular. I got my email from Teespring earlier that's sold quite a bit. And of course, Buy Me a Coffee, and now on Entropy. So let's go check on Entropy first, because I have that tab open and I don't have to do as much scrolling for anything like that. But okay, here we go. Let's see here. Ben White for $3 US. Oh, hello, Ben White. I usually see you on the Distributive streams doing your weekly romance updates. You're kind of a niche chat celebrity over there. But anyways, he says, regarding modus vivendi liberalism and progressive liberalism, did progressive liberalism naturally flow from the classical liberal tradition, or was there a significant philosophical break somewhere? Well, I'm certainly glad that you asked, because our good friend, and I really can't say good friend, but someone I respect and someone that we should respect, Paul Gottfried, had wrote a book called After Liberalism. And the first chapter kind of addresses this issue, because the nature of what is defined as liberalism, or even what's defined as classically liberal, has changed really since the Enlightenment had began, and it also had revealed itself depending on which nation you were in talking about liberalism. Condorcet had a different definition of liberalism. Ludwig Karl von Haller had a different definition of liberalism than, say, what Joseph de Maistre would argue, which is referenced severally throughout The Great Delusion, the book we were just reviewing. Some would argue that for instance, here in America, like the really big philosophical break really does come post Civil War, and most importantly, post 1876. You really do kind of see two instances emerge here in the United States. For example, you sort of see the nationalist sort of Anglo exit idea of liberalism, focusing primarily on the negative rights, give way to more progressive positive rights, whether that be through making democracy more available for everybody and taking a more liberal use of the Monroe Doctrine, which is why you see in the early 20th century sort of these expansive amounts of interventions in the Caribbean and Central and Latin America. But as for a specific philosophical break, that sort of becomes the challenge of trying to identify, and it's even something that Gottfried talks about in chapters 1 and 2 of After Liberalism, which we covered, and it's available to all patrons on Subscribestar, where we reviewed the first half of the book. But as for a significant philosophical break, let me see if I can pull out the text and give you a more dedicated answer than just pulling off the top of my head, because I'm quoting him. I do have the book here in front of me. So here we go. Alrighty. The other issue too, right, is that even non-liberal thinkers were sometimes to be associated as proto-liberal. So John Rawls famously had done that. So, for instance, other contemporary social democrats who call themselves liberal, Rawls, for instance, fails to discuss power. But hold on, let me get to the real part here where he talks about it in regards to liberalism. Here we go. So, for instance, according to Feiner, who had written a polemic against Mr. Hayek and the denial of staggering powers being used by the post-war period by English socialists, he argued that England's march towards socialism was a happy consequence of democracy, the product of the last 300 years of severe mental labor, careful reflection, and piece-by-piece development. Post-war social economic construction took place on the basis of party programs, thoroughly elaborated by the greatest detail by intra-party discussion and amendment and reconciliation among the many interests that are domesticated in each political party, and before they are put forward for electorate in a considerable particularity. And he had argued that this emerges out of the liberal tradition. But I don't know where the philosophical break becomes, because my definition of what might be classical liberal could meet the definition of someone who's classically liberal in terms of what's progressive. 6 years ago, I would have definitely called myself a modus vivendi liberalism or a classical one, but and I even have here one of these days I might put it out. I might wear it on camera. Is I have a very cringe T-shirt looking back. I have the classically liberal done in the Coca-Cola font, and it's in white, text coloring on a red T-shirt. But I mean, I don't have a more specific answer other than perhaps I can, take that question and maybe make it a better video essay or something like that. But I'm going to refresh entropy and see if anything else came in. And then we'll scroll up and do the rest. Okay. So on to that. Because democracy, I see that the more libertarian among us have already started providing their definitions of democracy and liberalism in the comments. So yeah. So here we go. Let me scroll up to the very beginning. That way I didn't miss anything. I said I would pay more attention to chat, but I did not, and that's on my fault. But and I missed all of the awful sex bots at the beginning. That's terrible. Absolutely evil of me. I'm terribly sorry. But so the first one of the super chats here on YouTube comes from Prince of Parma for $5 US. Played Twilight Imperium for the first time 2 weeks ago. What's your favorite civilization? Looking forward to your stream with Radlib. Well, I don't know when Radlib and I are going to cover that book. I do need to follow follow up with him on that. But Twilight Imperium, if you don't know, is probably one of my favorite board games that you can probably go out there, just because it's if you want to waste 12 hours, if you want to waste a weekend away, and it's not really a waste, it's just something that I quite enjoy. I have the two civilizations I normally play, Prince of Parma, is I usually either will play as the Federation of Soul, or I will simply just go out of my way and play the Barony of Letnev. Those are the two that I primarily go with. I really do enjoy that game. Maybe one of these days, I could maybe do something on Tabletop Simulator. I do really miss going to my game store and playing the various games that I owned, just because COVID happened, and then at the same time I had dialysis, so like really my life had been totally upended for gaming, and now I do this, and I've taken up other sort of activities in my life. One of which I'll probably post a picture of it soon. I've kind of mentioned it in passing to a few others, but I've recently taken up the work of writing icons and icon painting, iconography. So, and I have a knack for it. Apparently, I've been kind of blessed in that regard. But I miss board games, and I miss game night. I really do. I miss that kind of stuff. Yassine for £5. Thank you so much. He says, "Would you ever do an analysis of the Ace Combat games? They are interesting games from a narrative perspective, and I know that you like flight sims. Um, be interesting. I mean, a lot of the narrative stuff is done through your radio and some nice CGI cutscenes that come in with it. Uh, I do like them. I mean, I played the most recent one, Ace Combat 7, which I really enjoyed. It had the perfect blend of like really fun arcadey stuff and modern day aircraft, and it's just a very pretty game. Um, and of course, it's based. I like to describe it as like a Metal Gear Solid, set within a alternate Earth where there's rail guns and asteroids, and everyone's got like modern day jets and such. But I mean, no, it's a lot of fun, and it was a return to the narrative in the most recent game. But maybe I could write something about it. I don't know if I'd do a video on it, but I wouldn't be opposed. I mean, maybe I can get a few people to come on and we can talk about the issues of the geopolitics of the of maybe the nations that exist within there. That'd be fun. But it's certainly a game that I do like. I'm a fan of flight sims, whether it's the IL-2 1946 games or the issues of, they're all analogs, yeah. But Belka did nothing wrong. Oh, there you go. Yeah, no, I really do like those games. I like flight sims. I like the IL-2 1946 ones. Although I did buy the expansion pack to do the issue of flying World War One prop aircraft. I love biplanes and open cockpit aircraft. That's why I like playing the low tier stuff on War Thunder. But that appears to be all of the super chats for this Sunday, which I'm always appreciative for. Your work makes it go a long way. And so, yeah, next week we will be live with Prudent Observations covering the issue of deglobalization, which I think these last few streams have all kind of paired really well in preparation for the 30th and talking about Turbo America. There's a lot of stuff there. And of course, there's a new Real Talk out. So if you haven't seen that, by all means, you should. The fishing videos will continue until the viewership improves. And then I am going to put out next week, even though I have my what's the word I'm looking for? Even though I have the Digital Archipelago on my channel this week, I am going to put out a channel introduction similar to what Academic Agent and other channels do, and it's going to cover the three things that I do: scripted videos, fishing No, it's just my internet, fellas. That's the problem. So I apologize on that issue. But okay, that's very frustrating. I apologize to everybody. I probably am going to have to buy a new router or something like that. He became liberal suddenly. Oh well, heaven forbid that happens. But anyways, it could have been the next Mustache Man. I doubt that. But yes, it is definitely the problem of rural internet for sure. It's been a lot more of a problem these last few weeks than it has been ever before. So yeah, no. But with that, I will just wish you all a very good rest of your Saturday. I hope to see you all next week, this Thursday, as well as next Saturday. And with that, I bid you all a farewell. Take care. God bless, and be prudent. See you guys.